was October 26, 1956. 3 days earlier, a revolution had broken out in Budapest against the Soviet rule. It was a revolution of young people, teenagers and college students who were fighting for independence, and in a few short weeks, the revolution would be beaten down and there would be brutal repercussions. But then, when Hungary eventually did gain independence from Soviet rule, it became a stuff of legends. And October 23rd would become a national holiday. But on that day, October 26th, there was still a lot of hope. There was also still a lot of confusion. In a small village in northwestern Hungary, far away from Budapest, there was a group of young men. My grandfather among them, just out of high school. They were preparing to start their mandatory military service. And before they had to report for duty, not knowing where they would go or whom they would have to fight, they wanted to have one last gathering, a farewell party. They had the drinks, they had the music, they had the company. They did not have a place to gather because there was a curfew in effect. It was forbidden to gather because the Soviet authorities were afraid that rebellions would break out in other cities outside of Budapest. But these young people still wanted to be together that evening. They wanted to laugh, they wanted to sing. So they went to the largest house in the village, the house of the village blacksmith. He had a great big courtyard, he had a workshop on one side and his home on the other side, and that's where the young people of the village got together to say goodbye. And they sang, and they danced, and played music, and they laughed, until suddenly, there was a knock on the gates to the courtyard. The local militia had shown up. They were enforcing the curfew. They heard the music and the laughter, and they wanted to know what was going on. What is happening here? What is with all these people? Somebody who was quick on his feet just looked around and he said, it's an engagement party. Because you see, the militia was also made up of local men. And they immediately wanted to know who's getting engaged. Somebody else looked around and he pointed at the blacksmith's daughter because it was her home. He said, well, she and him over there. That was my grandfather. And then the local militiamen each got a glass of wine and they raised a glass to the newly engaged couple. And then, as it happened in many places in many times, they decided to turn a blind eye and they walked away. And the party continued. Well, the blacksmith's daughter was my grandmother. And later on, those two did end up getting engaged. And they did end up getting married. They didn't know that yet on that evening at that party. But they did become my grandparents eventually. But in the following few weeks, a lot of those young men, a lot of those young women would flee the country. And they would travel far, far away. And many of them would never return.
It was November 1956, and bullet holes were still in the buildings. There was a young man. His name was Miklos. He'd left home when he was 16 years old. He didn't really feel like he belonged there, so he traveled to the big city. He apprenticed for a bike mechanic, and there began his lifelong love. But he didn't just fix them. After a few years, he started to get on. He started to ride them. At the time he was 19 years old, he was riding for the Hungarian national team. At a time when many people weren't allowed to leave the country, he was able to go and travel and compete. Then there was a woman. Her name was Irene. And Irene was born and bred in Budapest. She had short brown hair. She had an infectious laugh. She loved the sparkly nightlife when it was happening. She loved to go hiking in the green Buda hills, picking cherries, making jam. Now, Irene also worked at a company as a secretary, and one day that company decided to sponsor a bike race. So imagine her delights when afterwards the young victor came down and started to chat to her. That's when Miklos and Irene met. They fell in love, and the rest, they say, is history. But I've always been very curious about that history. See, Miklos and Irene, they were my grandparents. When I was a kid, their story was always a romance. You see, as they fell in love with the revolution swirling around them one night in November 1956, my grandfather knocked on my grandmother's door. By this time, they were already engaged. But he said to her, "It isn't safe anymore. I'm leaving tonight. You can stay with your friends and your family and all the people you love, or you can leave and come with me." She said yes. So under the cover of night, they made their way west. They headed towards the Austrian border, and in fact, they would have passed right by Menfujon, where there were two other possibly engaged folks. At that time, if you were caught defecting, you would be shot, and probably you would be killed. My grandparents, they made it across the border into Austria. Somehow they got a plane ticket to the US, where I grew up. Now, movement, travel, it's so easy, right? But the decision to go, it isn't always so easy. And I'm curious, what's beneath the surface there? What are the reasons we leave? When we leave somewhere, what is it we leave behind? But what is it that we also make new life for?
And you see, legend says that hundreds of years before the revolution, hundreds of years before earlier revolutions that Hungary had for independence, young Hungarian people used to cross that western border for an entirely different reason. They were traveling to study magic. See, contrary to what some contemporary sources would have you believe, the most famous magic schools in Europe in the Middle Ages were, there was one in Iceland, there was one in Spain, and then there was one in Italy. And most of the Hungarian students would go to Italy, to Bologna, to study magic. There was a hidden magic school there, deep under the mountains, somewhere deep underground. And they would always have a class of 13 people. And that class would study for 13 years in that hidden school. And they would learn a lot about magic, but all those 13 years, they would not have any magic in them. They were not born with magic inside of them. But when the 13 years were up, there was a ceremony. And the class had to sit on a great big wheel of fortune, and it would spin and spin and spin around with them until one of them would fall down and die. And the other 12 remaining students would gain magic powers. And they would become Garabonciás wizards. They had their magic powers in a great big leather-bound book that they would always carry with them. They could do marvelous things. They could fly. They could teleport. They could put a stick in the ground. It would grow into a tree in an instant. And they had power over dragons. They could tame them and ride them. They would leave the school. They would go out into the world, and they would travel from village to village, from house to house. People would recognize them by their dusty boots and their torn cloaks and the great big black hat that they would wear and the great big leather-bound book that they were carrying. And they would ask for small things, a cup of milk, a slice of bread. And if people were kind to them, then they would put a sign on the door and good luck would come to that house. If people were mean or stingy, they would put another sign on the door and bad luck would follow. Garabonciás wizards would stand up to witches. They would break curses. They would protect villages from hailstorms or tragedies. And they would travel like that from one place to the next, never settling down, helping people whenever they could. They would make their way back to Hungary, and people would recognize them as the Garabonciás students coming from far away. Wherever they went, however long it took them to make their way back from the west towards their home, they came back forever changed.
It was August 2013, I was 20 years old when I left the United States. I was headed for somewhere that was possibly magical, possibly full of wizards. That land was Scotland. 2 years prior, I had found myself entirely lost in a toxic relationship. I had become estranged from my family, from my friends, from myself. Before that, I'd spent many years struggling with my mental health. So if you ask me why I had gone to Scotland, the first answer I would have given you would have been the surface, to go to university. If you ask me why again, I'd dig a bit deeper and I would say to run away. If you ask me why a third time, I'd reach beneath the surface and I would say to find where I belong. I didn't feel like I really belonged where I grew up. Maybe some of you here have felt that way too. Perhaps it was because I had a second-generation Hungarian mother whose mother had very clear opinions about Americans that she told to her, and in turn my mother told to me. Or perhaps it's just like that. Sometimes there are people who are born whose skin don't always fit right, whose bones don't settle, and they feel like they need to go. Still, my Americanness is very much a part of who I am. For those of you that know me, maybe you saw initially in the program that I'm billed as a Hungarian storyteller, and this is also slightly confusing for me, part of this process here. And the thing is, my Americanness, it seeped into the things that I did here. It was Scotland that I created a mental health storytelling organization, where I created space to help people connect to creative expression, to healing stories, to maybe talking about the things that trouble them. I have been told that that's perhaps not the most British thing. It was Scotland where I became a storyteller, where I found this incredible building. I was able to start my apprenticeship and start to realize that people had really held back when they hadn't told me that you were allowed to be a storyteller. I was able to travel down to London to be mentored. There were so many people I met here who helped me along the way. And then it was Scotland, where I was able to find my chosen family and friends, the ones who helped me feel safe and secure, to grow and develop, to be able to chase a dream that I'd always had, but never felt like I had permission to achieve. To learn Hungarian, to learn more about my heritage. And it was Scotland, where I was given a story that's rested just here in my heart, wherever I've traveled. Once, far, far in the north of Scotland, on the Isle of Skye at the base of the Cullen Mountains, there were 3 young women, and they were gathering blackberries. The autumn was just turning, the air was crisp like it's crisp now, and they were laughing and chattering as they went to pick and collect these beautiful berries and put them in their hands. Now there was one girl among the 3 who had this thirst, this hunger for the most perfect berry, the most perfect bite. She was sure it had to exist somewhere. And so she started to seek in the foothills. She started to climb higher and higher, gathering all the way, putting all those berries in her apron. She paused a moment, and she realized the voices of her friends, she could no longer hear them. There wasn't the laughter, there wasn't the chatter. She looked back and she realized there wasn't even a path behind her. She was just surrounded by craggy stones, and in fact there was a mist that was starting to gather around her. She couldn't see forwards, she couldn't see backwards. She started to crouch down because she was beginning to feel afraid. And that's when she heard the noise. It sounded like something was coming directly towards her. And when she was young, she had heard the myths, the stories about the giants of the Cullen Mountains. And she wondered, was she about to meet some of them now? As she crouched, there was a breath of wind. The mist cleared, and there, there was a herd of deer. It was a bunch of mothers and their young children, and she watched as they picked their way sure-footed through the rocks. She didn't know where else to go, so she thought maybe these deer can lead me to safety. So she got in line behind them, and once she did, their heads pricked up as if listening to the voice of the mountain itself, and they began to walk. They began to walk up and up the mountain. She carried on behind them, but the thing was, they weren't heading anywhere that she knew. So by the time they got to the very top of the mountain, she wasn't tired and lost. There was a cave. And in the mouth of the cave, there was an old woman. The old woman looked to the deer, she spoke to them, they started to move away. And that's when the old woman noticed the young one. "What are you doing here?" "Please, I was gathering these berries and I got lost. I think I climbed too far up. If you take them, will you give me shelter for the night?" The old woman took the berries. She turned back, she looked in the cave, and there was an old man, her husband. They spoke in a strange language the young girl had never heard before. When the old woman turned back, she said, "For one night, you may not stay here, but for a year and a night, you may." What could she do? The young woman said yes, and there began her apprenticeship. During the days, the old woman would teach her how to tend to the deer, how to gather their milk. She taught her how to go out into the mountainside and gather the beautiful herbs that grew there. The bog myrtle, golden asphodel, the wild mint. The young woman would pick these, and she would give them to the old woman. Now the old woman, every night, in the mouth of that cave, she would build a big fire. She would sprinkle the herbs on top of it, and there she would put the deer's milk. The deer's milk would bubble and boil until it congealed into a beautiful, soft cheese. Crowded. The making of this cheese was the old woman's entire life. When she was done, she'd take that cheese, she would go to her husband who sat there in the back of the cave. She would hand it to him, and he was seated on a small stool in front of a rock pool filled with a little bit of water. The old man would take the cheese in his hand. He would look into the surface of that water. It showed everything that was happening in the world. He'd reach beneath, he'd pull it up, and he'd start to shape the cheese. And the shaping of the cheese was this old man's entire life. He and his wife were the makers of dreams. Now every night when he'd finished shaping all his cheese, he'd step to the front of the cave. The sun would be setting. You could see it pink and orange along the horizon. He'd hold up his hands, dreams in each of them. In his right hand, he held beautiful reveries, lovely imaginative dreams. There were birds that would swoop from the sky and take them. Wrens, songbirds, cardinals. They'd take these dreams and they'd slip them underneath the eyelids. But in his right hand, he held evil apparitions, haunting dreams that were taken by birds of ill omen, vultures, rooks, ravens. They'd swoop down and they'd carry these dreams under the eyelids.
I became a Hungarian storyteller when I first traveled to Americas. Before that, I was just a storyteller who lived in Hungary. In fact, for the longest time, nobody told me I was a storyteller. I grew up steeped in stories. My parents, my grandparents told me a lot of tales. I heard all of the folklore that Hungarian children grew up with, but nobody ever told me either that you could get paid for this. In fact, my grandmother claimed that people would pay my grandfather to shut up. That's the same grandmother and grandfather who were fake engaged in '56, and they were real storytellers. But I didn't find out until I was at the university that you could be a professional storyteller. And back then, 16 years ago, this was not very well known in Hungary. We certainly didn't have the festivals, the conferences, the degree programs that other countries might have. So I ended up getting a scholarship to travel to the United States and study storytelling. So I too traveled west to find out about the beautiful, magical world of storytelling and those people who are professional storytellers. And people in Hungary were a little skeptical about this decision. I got questions like, do Americans even have stories? Do they even have, don't they just stand on stage and talk about themselves? And people didn't know why I would want to go to America when we have perfectly good Hungarian folklore right here. But I did go, and I did discover that there were all of these different kinds of storytelling, and all of these different kinds of storytellers who were all friendly and helpful, and they created a community around me that I could explore storytelling myself. But wherever I went, to the conferences, to the festivals, a lot of times I was the Hungarian storyteller at the event. Sometimes I was the only Hungarian storyteller far and wide, and people would ask me things like, what are Hungarian stories like? Can you tell us a Hungarian story? And up to that point, I never really considered what makes Hungarian folktales uniquely Hungarian. They were just stories. To me, growing up with them, they were just what stories are. They were filled with completely normal, everyday things, like castles that spin around on duck legs, and magic horses that eat fire and drink palinka, and witches who have an iron nose, and little devils that help the hero. In fact, I made that mistake once. I was telling stories at an American Catholic school, and I said hell, and all the third graders were scandalized. And I realized it's really hard to tell a Hungarian folktale without mentioning the devil. So it was a cultural experience, but I began to see the faces in the audience, and there was some confusion, but there was also excitement and curiosity and surprise. Hungarian children know that obviously if there are 3 dragons in a folk tale, then the first one is going to have 3 heads, and the next one's going to have 7 heads, and then the last one's going to have 9 or 12. That's just how it goes. We don't even have one-headed dragons. Those are weird. So I was discovering Hungarian folk tales as something exotic abroad, and I was also discovering my heritage and seeing it in a whole new light. And I was discovering the responsibility of representing Hungary abroad as a storyteller. And I went back to the Hungarian tales that I grew up with. I started looking at them again and started mapping them out around Hungary and seeing how landscape can affect storytelling and the tales that come from different places. And I realized that most of the big famous Hungarian tales that I was so familiar with came from completely different parts of the country. And I wanted to see what the tales are where I grew up. Of course, I knew many of them from my grandparents, but I dug deeper and explored further. Northwestern Hungary, around my hometown, which is Győr, and the like the village of my grandparents, is riverlands. It's flat. There is a lot of woods, wildflower meadows, and rivers and lakes everywhere. And as I dug into those stories, that folklore, I began to find a whole different magical world filled with fairies who live underwater. And they brush their golden hair, and their hair turns into golden dust that you can still pan from the river. And dragons that live in the swamps and the marshes, and the Garabanci ash deserts. Students who travel west and then come back with magic and stories to tell. So in America, I became a Hungarian storyteller, proud of my heritage and happy to share it. And I also became a professional storyteller, and Americans are very good at teaching you how to be a professional anything. But then after 6 years, I returned. They taught us marketing in storytelling school, okay? This is very professional. And I returned after 6 years to Hungary, but then, you know, I had stories to tell, and I had an identity as a storyteller, and then my people were telling me things like, you sound like an American. So the journey continues, and it is definitely a journey of transformation.
It's funny how where you are can influence who you are. Because when I was growing up in the USA, I was very much connected to my Hungarianness. I remember wearing little embroidered vest and embroidered shirt to international night at my elementary school. I remember eating rakot krumpli that my mom would make for me, layers of boiled egg, boiled potato, kielbasa, all stewed together in this sour cream and paprika sauce. I remember the random phrases of Hungarian that I picked up from my mother. If I was going, cover your mouth or the baked pigeon's going to go down your throat. At least that's the context that she used it in for me. So then, imagine my surprise when I actually arrived to Hungary as some kind of American, Scottish storytelling mix. You see, I had worked up the courage to finally apply for this scholarship to study Hungarian language and culture, the Borási Intézet. I'd actually learned about it 6 years previous, but I didn't necessarily feel like I could give myself permission. But I just arrived to Hungary with all of these fragments. I had fragments of stories of my family, I had fragments of the language, but I also had fragments that felt like I belonged. When I speak Hungarian now, I think because when I heard it when I was younger, my mouth can make its way around it. Often I'll have conversations with people and it will take 5 or 10 minutes before they realize that I'm not a native Hungarian speaker. And they're astounded. I once was having a conversation with someone, we were chatting, and all of a sudden he used this word that I never heard before, telo. Estetelo. What? Michoda? Finally, is this your phone? Tello is a short name for telephone. And I just had never heard this piece of slang before. It's like, you're not Hungarian, okay. And so I realized that I had these fragments of me that I was always searching for. The thing is, it took many obstacles along the way for me to get there. You see, you remember that relationship that I'd had before when I was a teenager? Well, once we had to do this exercise, we had to write down our dreams. The dreams had to be written in red pen, because if you write them in red pen, somehow they come true more. And so I wrote them, I handed the paper to him so he could look at them, and one by one he proceeded to tell me why my dreams were wrong. Why would you go to Edinburgh? I'm here. Why would you learn Hungarian? That is pretty much a useless language. Learn something more useful. So I took it in my heart. It made it that much harder to go. After I graduated university here, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I thought, there's that scholarship, maybe I'll go. I was on the phone with my dad, and I said, Dad, I think I should go to Hungary and learn Hungarian. And well-intentioned as he was, he said, Lily, why would you go learn Hungarian? That's not a very useful step in your professional development. So I didn't. And it took 7 years of living here, of finding myself, my roots, finding some elements of belonging, before I felt courageous enough to take that leap into the unknown. 7 years in Scotland in my cave of transformation. And it made me think of how when we actually step into the unknown, we learn incredible things. Things that we take with us on our future journeys, whether those journeys are back home or onto the next adventure.
Once upon a time, there was a little village. And people who lived there would send all the sheep with the shepherd, the village shepherd, out to pasture. And the shepherd was responsible for counting them when they came back home. And he was responsible for taking care of all the sheep. But one day, as he was gathering them up, he realized that somehow one sheep had gone missing. And he was devastated to find out. He was so careful about counting them and taking care of them. So the next day, he made sure to keep his eye on all of them wherever they went. And he saw that some of the sheep were wandering down through the bushes to a little lake nearby. And he followed. And just as he followed, he saw the water of the lake beginning to bubble and boil, and then two terrifying large serpentine heads rose out of the lake. There was a two-headed dragon in the lake. The two heads rose up from the water, snatched up two of the sheep, and disappeared with them underwater. And the shepherd gathered all the sheep and ran back to the village, telling everybody that they had a dragon problem. And this was not the age of heroes. This was not the age of knights and princes. They didn't have anybody who could deal with a dragon problem. And they didn't know what to do. They just told everyone, especially the children, to stay away from the pasture and stay away from the lake. A couple of days later, one of the men from the village was coming back from market from a nearby town. And as he was going comfortably along the road in his ox cart, thinking about this and that, he suddenly saw someone by the side of the road. It was a young man with dusty boots and a torn cloak and a great big black hat on his head, carrying a great big leather-bound book under his arm. And the man stopped the cart and he said, "Young man, do you need a ride somewhere?" And the young man said, yes, please, can you take me to your village? I'm looking for shelter for the night." "Of course, sure, why not?" So the young man climbed to the back of the cart and he lay down and he said, "I am very tired. I think I will sleep a little. But while I'm sleeping, please do not touch my book." And then he pulled the hat over his face and he immediately fell asleep. And the cart went on. Now, had he not been told not to look at the book, he wouldn't have even thought about it. But now that he had been told not to look at the book, all he could think about was looking at the book. This man was not really a man for reading, but he kept stealing glances over his shoulder, looking at the great big leather-bound book, and eventually curiosity won. And he reached back and very carefully lifted that great big leather-bound book and put it on his lap, and he opened it up. And there were strange letters in that book, writing he couldn't read or comprehend, and it was written in black and green and red, possibly to make it come true better. And there were signs and symbols and drawings of plants and flowers, and he just kept turning the pages, and he knew that he was holding something very special in his hands. And finally he turned the page and he saw a phrase that he recognized, one that he could read, and he got so excited that he read it aloud. "Emelkedj fel." He didn't know why that phrase would be in the book, so he just kept turning the pages, but suddenly something fell off. And he looked up and he looked around and he realized that the cart was not on the ground anymore. Emelkedj fel means rise up. And the cart was rising slowly into the air, and the ox was still walking, not sure what was happening. And they were going higher and higher and higher, and the man was terrified about being so high up in the air. He didn't know what was happening, and he was about to slam the book shut when the young man behind him woke up. He looked around, he saw what was happening, and he lunged forward and he put his hand on the book. "Don't close it!" He took the book and he turned some pages, found another phrase, "Ereszkedj le." And then the cart began to lower back down to the ground until they were back on the road, and the ox was very happy. And then the young man closed the book and he said, "I told you not to look." But now the man knew who this young person was. He was not just a traveling student, he was a Garavonciás wizard. And he had heard the stories from his grandparents, and he said, "Could you please help us? There is a dragon in the lake near our village, and we've been looking for someone to help us get rid of the dragon. And I hear that people with the magic books, traveling Garavonciás students, that they have power over dragons." The young man said, "Take me to your village and maybe I will help." One day around, the young man walked around the village and he looked at the fields and he inspected everything and he looked at the lake from a distance and he said, "Yes, I can help you, but I will need a couple of days before I do." So they hosted him in the man's house and they gave him bread and boiled eggs and milk. That's all that the Garabonci students eat. And everybody came to the house because everybody was curious about the guests. Everybody wanted to see who he was. They'd never seen a real wizard before. And they had questions and they asked him to tell stories about his travels. And a couple of days went by. Until finally one morning the Garabonci went outside. He looked around the fields. He looked at the sky. And then he said, "Today is the day." He gathered up his belongings. He said goodbye to the people in the village. But one of the young boys, the youngest son of his host, he said, "You can come with me to witness what happens." So the boy and the wizard walked down across the fields to the lake. And when they got close to the lake, the Garabonci said, "Stand here. There is this gnarled old pear tree next to the lake." He said, "Stand here by the tree, tie yourself to this tree, and hold on. I promise nothing will happen to you, but from here you can see what happens." And the boy did. He took off his belt, he tied himself to that old pear tree, and he held on to the branches and he watched. The Garabonci walked to the edge of the water, and he opened his book, and he turned the pages. And he began to read in a language that the boy did not understand. And as he was reading these magic words, the water began to bubble, and it began to boil. And the two heads of the two-headed dragon rose out of the water, and they were terrifying, and their jaws were wide open. And the Garabonci reached into his bag and pulled out 2 balls made of pitch. And then he threw one into one mouth of the dragon and the other one into the other mouth. And the jaws snapped shut and they stuck that way. And as the dragon was struggling and throwing itself this way and that way, the Garabonci reached into his bag again and pulled out a double set of reins and threw them over the 2 heads of the dragon. And then he turned a page in his book again and read some magic words, and a saddle appeared on the back of the dragon. And then he took a great big running leap and he jumped onto the back of the dragon and held onto the reins. And the dragon was first just throwing itself this way and that way, splashing water everywhere. And then finally, as the Garabonci pulled on those reins, it flew up. Oh yeah, these dragons can fly. See, these dragons that live in the lakes and the rivers of northwestern Hungary, they are water dragons. But when they do fly, they create storms. This dragon flew up from the lake, straight up into the sky. The Garabonci holding on, trying to tame it and trying to steer it. And it flew in great circles around and around and around above the village. And as it flew, dark clouds gathered around it. And then, as it moved its tail, flipped its tail this way and that, there was thunder. There was lightning. The Garabonci flew on the back of the dragon this way and that way, and a terrible storm brewed up, and the rain began to fall, and then there was hail everywhere, until finally the dragon tired itself out, and it flew in a straight line away into the distance. The Garabonci riding on its back, and the clouds and the storm followed. And the sun came out. The boy untied himself from the tree, and he was drenched, but he was not hurt. And he ran back to the village and told everybody what he had seen. The dragon never came back. The Garabonci never came back either. People made up all kinds of stories about where he'd gone and what he would do with the dragon, and those are stories for another time. Mm-hmm. But then years passed, and the boy grew up. And one day he stood in front of his father and he said, "Father, I am going to school."
Sometimes dreams are slipped under the eyelids of people by night. Sometimes dreams are reveries that we have while waking, imaginations of where we might head. Sometimes dreams are expectations of how things might be. But often, reality is much different from the dreams. So what was I hoping for? What was I imagining when I went to Hungary? I guess I was hoping that I'd be able to understand my mom and her sisters when they chat about people when we were out at restaurants. I was hoping that I would discover some family that still was alive that I could connect to. I was hoping to piece together some of these fragments and maybe uncover some of those lost stories. Why did my grandparents leave? What was it like? But the truth is, that story has been much messier than I would have hoped. You see, I had to gather all these fragments, and I didn't know exactly what to do. And the first thing I did was to ask my mom if there was anyone we still knew. And so I was in, I think, my third quarantine of the time after I moved to Hungary, due to moving in a pandemic, when I got a letter from my mom. Inside of it, there was a list. On the list, there were names, but very few names. Turns out my grandparents hadn't really kept in touch with friends and family when they left. But of the few names that were on that list, more than half of them had in brackets next to it, no longer alive. There was one living name on that list, and it was my grandmother's best friend's daughter's niece and her husband. There was no number, it's just an address. I haven't yet worked up the courage to go knock on that door, but maybe after this, I might just. And then I started to interview my family that was still alive, my mom, our sisters. And this is when I learned something else, that often when people are second or third generation immigrants, that maybe those are the stories their parents don't share when they're leaving from trauma or from pain. And so there wasn't so much that my mom and her sister were able to embed. But still, there have been hopeful parts, exciting parts. There was the promise of a recording that my grandfather made at the end of his life. It exists somewhere deep in a Florida storage unit, so we haven't found it yet, but he was dictating part of his life right before he passed away. There was some research I did on a website of archives. I found articles of when my grandfather was a cyclist, of races that he won, how he got into it, what the weather was like that day, and I've been able to imagine him and his life so much more. There's an actual physical bike that they had. My grandfather started a bike repair shop when he moved to the US. He never stopped cycling, and I've taken that bike from the US over to Hungary. I've had it refurbished, and now I cycle around the streets of Budapest, and I imagine him there too. But I've been curious, why am I so drawn to this? Of course, we want to know about our history and where we come from, but I have a brother, I have 4 cousins, and none of them are bothered at all by this. And then I learned this fact that really captured my imagination. You see, when a female fetus is an embryo, at 20 weeks old, she will have a fully formed reproductive system. She will be born with all the eggs that she'll ever have. There's one other thing I found in my research. When my grandfather knocked on my grandmother's door that night in November 1956, she was 16 weeks pregnant with my mom. And so I imagined somehow my grandmother, my mom inside, still in Hungary, and somehow, somewhere, there is a small piece of me in there too. Maybe that's what pulls me back. But when I learned this fact, it suddenly switched the story that I knew. One that had always been a romance. And unfortunately, it turned it into a tragedy. What choice did my grandmother really have when her fiancé knocked on her door while she was pregnant and said, "Are you coming with me?" I never met my grandmother. She died before I was born from alcoholism. I've heard that at the end of her life it was particularly tricky. And when I approached my mom's youngest sister, my other aunt, and asked her if she would be interviewed for this story, she refused. I think perhaps there are still stories that she'd like to remain lost. Who knows what the future will hold? And it got me thinking about what happens when we actually come into contact with our dreams, when we start to taste them and feel the shape of them. So inevitably, we come back changed. Every night, the old man would hold his dreams up to the sunset to take their color, up in that cave at the top of the Coney Mountains. Every night, the young woman, she would watch. And as she watched, she learned, and she started to learn the language of dreams. Past, of present, of future, she watched them fly away underneath the eyelids of the world. But time, as it always does. And so it came to be that a year and a night would come. That next morning, as the sun was rising, the old woman approached the young one. She said, "Thank you for your service. You have done well. Go now and seek your reward." The old woman spoke to the deer in that strange tongue again. Again, their heads pricked up as if listening to the voice of the mountain, and the old woman pushed the young one behind the deers. This time, they started to travel back down the mountain, past the river burns, past the little bushes and heath that grew. But they were going in a direction that the young girl had never seen before. They'd come up one way, they were going down the other, so when they arrived at the bottom of the mountain, she found herself on a beach. Long and sandy, the waves were lapping, the deer were still around her. She tried to move forward, but they kind of gathered in around her. They held her in place. They made it so that she had to look out at the sea. And as she did, she saw that there was something in the distance coming closer. As it got closer, she realized it was a small boat, a coracle, made of skins and wood, and in that boat, there was a young man. There was a golden circlet around his neck. He was a prince. That little boat came up on the shore. It pulled up onto the sand. He jumped out. The deer cleared away, and he said, "It's you. I've seen you in my dreams. Please, you have to come with me. Please help. You see, I've come from a faraway foreign land. My father, the king, he's haunted by nightmares. And because of this, our city, our kingdom, it falls into disarray. I know that you can help me. My dreams have told me." Well, what could she do? She said yes. She stepped into that boat with him. They went out across the water. They went far and far to a far away land. When she arrived, she met with the king. She told him all she knew of the language of dreams, and they were able to help him heal. And when he healed, so did the city, so did the lands, and so it was that the renown of this woman who could tell of dreams, tell of past, of present, of future, had spread. And she lived a long, happy, healthy, and wise life there in that far away land. They say that much of this wisdom is lost now.
When I left Hungary for the first time, I was already a storyteller. I was carrying the stories of my family and my heritage with me. When I returned 6 years later, I was a Hungarian professional storyteller, and much had changed.
When I first met Jenga, she asked me, "Are you an American, a Scottish, or a Hungarian storyteller?" To be honest, I didn't really have a good answer. I'm still not sure I do. You see, when I left Scotland, I was very much an American storyteller. When I arrived to Hungary, I had become somehow a Scottish storyteller. And now I've arrived back to Scotland as a Hungarian storyteller.
And so it happened that in October 2020, two Hungarian storytellers met in a cafe in Budapest for the first time.
And so it happened that 2 years later, in October 2022, there were two Hungarian storytellers in Scotland sharing their stories.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us. And if you would like to talk to us and have conversations about anything, then we will be here all night. Until the next show anyway, yes.
Upstairs.
Yes, upstairs.